I really wanted to slow down on this first Spey cast to drive home some essential fundamentals used in every cast. This will allow me to explain other casts much quicker as we move forward.
The snap tee is one of my favorite casts, and it's a really good one to start learning how to Skagit cast with. It's a very powerful cast. It works great with sink tips. You can use it with floating lines, and it's pretty easy to learn. So just looking at what your feet do, if I'm going to cast out this direction, I'm going to try to get my feet somewhat pointed towards my target, but I'm going to actually turn my hips looking almost straight downstream. I'm going to start with my rod tip, again, right at the water surface, but we're going to start with our left hand on our left hip. This is going to feel a little awkward at first, but you'll get used to it, and it's going to help you set up for a better forward cast later on, believe it or not. So our first goal here is we need to set our anchor. And by that I mean we're going to make a move to put our anchor upstream from us. Now the perfect anchor placement as a baseline. If I stick my rod tip up as far as I can at about a 45-degree angle, right about there is about our average fly placement for our anchor. So this first move is really about just getting our fly up above us. So I'm going to start off in my start position. And the easiest way to think about this is what your rod tip does first. So I found a great analogy is if you think about putting a piece of chalk in the end of your rod tip, and you've got a big chalkboard in front of you. The top of your chalkboard is about 45, maybe 50 degrees right here. That's as high as your rod is going to go on this first move. So we're going to start left hand, left hip, rod straight downstream, and we're going to draw a capital D on our chalkboard with our rod tip. So I'm going to go up the chalkboard, straight vertical, around the D, and right back down to where I started. This move is essentially breaking the surface tension, getting the fly to lift out of the water, and I'm ducking the rod underneath, so the fly is going to travel over the top of the rod. So the power application here, and this is really important, is you're going to start smooth and slow. You're lifting that fly up. As you get to the top of your D, you're going to start to come around, and your acceleration is at the bottom of the D. So this whole move is one smooth acceleration, and the power application is really late, right at the end of the D, or sort of the bottom edge of it. Let's take a look at how that looks with the whole line out. So I'm going to start left hand, left hip. Rod tip straight down below me. I'm going to make a vertical lift, accelerate around, and I've set my anchor. What's so critical in this move is that the rod starts going vertical first. What you don't want to have happen is your rod starts to lean on the lift, because you'll never get that fly out of the water. Think about the capital D, straight up the edge, accelerate around. Now, one of the things that sort of helps me sort of place my anchor and really kind of thinking about where I'm going to cast, if you think about, your start position is right here. Imagine where you're going to cast. Maybe pick a target on the other side of the river. So your D is going to work within the confines of this triangle. In other words, the curved edge of the D is going to go no further than your firing line. By doing that, it allows us to place our anchor in very specific spots. So if I was going to cast straight across the river, my D becomes much wider. If I was going to cast more downstream, I'd make a much narrower D. So I'm going to cast slightly downstream. I'm going to make a vertical lift, make my setup. You can see where my fly lands. Now if I was going to cast further downstream, I'm going to make that D much narrower. And the fly only landed a couple feet downstream, but that gives me the ability to cast down there. And the same would be true if I was casting more cross stream or even upstream. I would just widen out that move, make a much bigger D. That places my anchor higher. And now I can cast across the river. So one of the things that I always want you to remember is, number one, where that fly lands is really important. The anchor, guys, is probably the hardest part of every Spey cast, and it's also the most important. Our average fly placement should be right up here, about 45 degrees away. If that fly lands too high up, in other words, if I set my anchor and my fly goes way up there, I come around to make my cast, I never pivoted the anchor. In other words, I got a big L in my line. If you think about it, I'll do it right out here in front of me. Everything is in a big L out there. That's what's called a bloody L. So if you set your anchor too high, a lot of times what you'll notice is that the cast either doesn't go out or you'll get some curling in the line, almost like a hook. Your fly will land upstream from where your fly line landed. So it's critical that that fly lands right on our 180-degree line. Now the other side of this is really from a safety standpoint. If your fly lands too low, in other words, I don't make a big enough D and that fly lands right in front of me, and I come around to cast, if I make that forward cast, I'm gonna be wearing that fly as jewelry. So from a safety standpoint, it really helps to set your anchor and turn your head and actually look to make sure that anchor landed exactly where you wanted it to. Now it's in a nice safe position. Fly placement is by far the most important part of your anchor, but there's two other things I always want you to think about in any spey cast that you do. We've already covered the importance of the fly landing in the correct spot on the 180-degree rule. There's two other things I want you to think about when you're setting your anchor though. The first is, when you set your anchor and this line lays on the water, we want to try to get that line to lay in as straight of a line as possible with no squiggles in it whatsoever. The squiggles are caused from just essentially making an abrupt lift and a pause and then coming down kind of hard. If there's any kind of an abrupt change in your speed, you're going to get slack on the water. Always remember, slack is the enemy. If you have slack in your line, you just have to work that much harder to get the rod to load. You've got to essentially get that slack out of the system before it starts to bend. So the key here is being smooth. It's all about a smooth lift and a smooth power application through that whole setup of the anchor, and we get a nice straight line. You know, one of the most common things you'll hear from either friends or casting instructors is, you just need to slow down. While that's not bad advice, you have to consider, why are you going fast? Usually, the reason for going too fast is because you're not feeling the rod load. Your arm knows what a fly rod feels like when it bends. Even if you've never done this before, as you sweep, if you're not feeling it bend, you're gonna move faster to try to find that load. So if you make a nice smooth laydown, as you start to sweep, the rod starts to load immediately. We start to bend that rod and you get that sweet feel that we all love when you're spey casting. So this is all about power application. If you pause at any point in this D movement that we're making, if I pause and then make an abrupt stop, you can see I get all this slack on the water out in front of me. If I make this move very smooth with that power application late, right there, I get a nice laydown, so everything is nice and straight. So we've got an anchor, and now we've got a nice straight line. The third thing I want you to think about is, when you finish this move, you should see a little loop of line form off your rod tip, right there on the water. It's about the size of a basketball, just curling off the rod and back upstream into the straight line. I call that the ripping loop. What that does is help reinforce load. In other words, when we start to sweep the rod into our D loop, that little loop is going to help you bend the rod. You're going to actually be ripping against that loop, which then will help bend the rod.
The ripping loop is formed by the power application at the bottom of the D that you drew your rod tip with. You'll notice if you don't use enough power, the ripping loop won't form. On the other hand, if you use too much power, the loop will end up 5 feet below the rod tip. Again, if you get the power right on the anchor setup, the loop will be just about the size of a basketball. If you're already an intermediate or advanced caster and you're wondering why some of your casts feel effortless, while other casts it's almost like you have to push the rod just to get it to load, most of the time the cause is from not following these disciplines of the anchor.
So just to summarize, the three most important things in the anchor is, number one, you have to have the fly in the 180-degree plane. Number two, you want to try to get that line to lay out as smooth as possible. And then number three, you get that little loop of line, the ripping loop, that'll all help you load the rod. So keep those three things in mind in every cast you do, and you're way ahead of the curve. So we've talked about the three fundamentals of the anchor: fly placement, straight line, ripping loop. There's one last thing I want you to think about in your anchor, and that's where the line lands in relationship to your body, because this is really going to change how the rod loads as we change this. In Disc 2, we're going to talk about how to change these different anchors for different fishing situations, but in order to create a baseline, we want to get you consistently putting that anchor in the same spot. So in a perfect world, when you set your anchor, if you stick your rod tip straight out from you, that line should land about a foot inside of the rod tip. So this is really controlled by a couple of things. Number one, how vertical your rod goes. So if I said earlier, think about the top of your chalkboard is about 45 degrees, maybe a little bit higher than that, maybe 50. If I lift to there and I make my D, that's going to land about a foot inside of the rod tip every time. The other thing that controls this is really the power application. So we talked about putting that power application on the D really late. And if I really think about making a smooth lift and putting the power application late, my line is going to land right where I want it to. If I put that power application a little early, so in other words, if I lift and I put the power application at the top of the D, look at how far out my anchor lands, way outside of my rod tip. This is a common mistake, and that's why I think it's really important to understand how you control where this thing lands. So just to summarize, you want to make sure that when you make this setup, your anchor is landing just about a foot inside of the rod tip. Again, that's our baseline. We'll show you how to change that later on for different fishing situations. So now that we've got our anchor set, now we get to do the fun part of spey casting, the D-loop. Now I want to make the distinction. When we set our anchor on this cast, I talked about drawing a D on the chalkboard. That's not the D-loop. That's just the rod tip path. The D-loop is really your back cast. Every spey cast has a D-loop. And you can see the D form behind me. Now in a roll cast, we had a very shallow D-loop. There was no energy. It's really what's called a deadline cast. In a spey cast, there's going to be a lot more energy. It's going to jump way further behind us. So our goal when we do the D-loop is to take the energy from down here and direct it into our 180-degree plane. That's really important. So the easiest way to think about this, let's just take the fly line out of the equation for a moment. Imagine that we've set our anchor. We have our fly above us, we've got this nice straight line and that little ripping loop below us. I'm right back to where I started at the beginning of my anchor. I'm going to imagine that I am a martini glass. I'm the stem, my martini glass is up here. So I'm going to make a vertical lift first up to my martini glass, just above my head, maybe at a 30-degree angle. Now from that point, the rod is going to track around the martini glass. So the rod's going to start moving out over the river, coming around and around and around, and then turn up into the firing position.
Turning up is a term used to describe when the rod tip goes from the flat plane of the D-loop and transitions into the firing position. The rod tip essentially makes a little U-turn to accomplish this.
So a really easy way to practice this martini glass is just to grab your fly line, put your rod tip up at the plane, right on your glass there, and loop the line off the rod tip down to your top hand on your rod. You can just practice keeping that rod on a flat plane, keeping that loop underneath the rod tip. You can even do this when you're off the water. Now, as you come around this martini glass, there's a power application. So you're going to start smooth and slow. And then you're going to accelerate back into the D-loop, trying to direct that energy back into the 180-degree plane. So let's put it together. I'm going to make my setup, I'm going to make a vertical lift up, I'm going to sweep around, and I'm going to accelerate around the plane. What's really critical here, guys, there's a number of things I want you to think about. Number one is just when that acceleration happens. A lot of times when you set your anchor, you're in such a hurry to lift and go around. The fly line's going everywhere, the rod's unloading, you're losing the tension on it. Every move that you make with a spey rod is going to be smooth and slow. So starting with the vertical lift, just a nice easy lift. It's not very mechanical. I'm going to start sweeping around and I'm going to accelerate into the D-loop. So the power application really happens as I sweep around when the rod comes in line with the 180-degree plane. So I start smooth and accelerate back. Now, if I've done this properly, a couple of different things are going to happen. Number one, when your anchor's out here, as you sweep around, that anchor is actually going to pivot into the D-loop without moving. So it's going to stay in one spot, but it's going to go from here to here.
This is what is referred to as a sustained anchor. The anchor pivots, but it does not move.
Number two is, as you make this sweep into the D-loop, you should be hearing line ripping through the water. So as I lift and I start to sweep, I'm actually tearing that line through the water. That's telling me that I'm loading the rod. If I don't hear that, chances are I'm not creating enough speed through my D-loop to load the rod with any efficiency. The flip side of that is if you start too fast with too much power, you're going to throw your D-loop straight upstream. So if I make my setup and I start with 50 miles an hour, the D-loop's going to go that way. Remember, we want to try to get that D-loop going back here in our 180-degree plane. So think about starting with 5 miles an hour as you start this sweep. Make your setup, start smooth and easy right here, and then accelerate around. Just always remember that this is a cast. Just like a single hand cast, when you make a back cast, you start smooth and slow and accelerate back. It's the same thing here. We're just doing it on a plane that's a flat plane. Now, a lot of you, when you learned how to Spey cast, you were taught that you set your cast up and your rod sweeps from low to a high position in your D-loop. Remember, there's never a wrong answer in this game. That's one way to do it. I think of it like this. When you have a longer bellied line, you need to traject your D-loop up. Because let's say you've got a 55, 60 foot line, that D-loop needs to climb or you're going to end up with too much line on the water. When you're casting these short little heads, usually what happens is if you start low and you sweep to high, you blow your anchor out. So you go, okay, I just need to slow down. So now you start fast and you slow down into your D-loop. Well, you're breaking one of the very fundamentals of casting. You need to make a smooth acceleration with a late power application. So all we're doing here by making this martini glass is we're throwing our D-loop a little lower to the water. I'm going to make a lift, sweep around, and now my D-loop just travels that much lower to the water. So what that really means is I just have more line resting on the water when I finish that D-loop. So now I can actually accelerate at the end of my D-loop right there, and I can compress that thing back. Just realize this, the more energy that you can get going this way, the more energy you're going to get going in front of you. So if you can throw your D-loop on a flat plane and put some energy into that D-loop, that's only going to help you make a more powerful forward cast. So as you form your D-loop plane, one of the most important things to remember is our box. I said earlier, you're always going to keep your hands inside of the box. So in order to do that, you need to make a move that will allow you to keep your hands inside of that casting box. So with the rod, when I set up, I make my lift, I think about my top hand pushing out over the water, extending almost entirely. My elbow isn't locking at this point, but it's coming to just before it locks. Then as I sweep around, now this hand gets to basically the edge of my box. So in order to keep my hand inside of the box, I need to start breaking my wrist and keeping the rod tip on the flat plane. So you can see how my wrist is breaking and I come into my firing position. A really good way to think about this is just imagine somebody that you'd really like to throw a lemon meringue pie at. Put the lemon meringue pie on your hand, make a lift, keep that pie on your hand through the whole sweep without coming outside of your box. Throw the pie at your high school bully. Lift, sweep, cast. You can do it with a rock, you can do it with whatever, but that's the motion of your hand. It's really important. If I don't break my wrist as I sweep, now if I keep that wrist straight, you can see how my elbow wants to come outside of the box and I open up my casting stroke. So it's really important that as you sweep around, you think about that wrist breaking as it comes to the edge of your box and letting the rod tip continue around the plane. Now, in order to do that, we have to add our bottom hand doing some of the work here. So as I sweep across, my bottom hand really starts to do a lot of the work right about here. And the rod tip now is being driven by my bottom hand. As I come around and I sweep into the firing position. So just to summarize, to keep the rod tip flat through the whole sweep on your martini glass, you've got to use wrist or you're going to open up your casting stroke. Just like in single hand casting, there's a timing in two-handed casting. And by that I mean, how much time do you have between your back cast and your forward cast? In single hand casting, when you make your loop, you're waiting for that loop to unroll and help you load the rod. In two-handed casting, your D-loop is doing that job. So two good tips to get your timing on. Number one, listen to your cast. When you hear the rip stop, shloop, cast, shloop, cast. That's a really easy one to remember. Another thing that'll help you is just watch your anchor out there on the water. Remember, as you make your D-loop, and that D-loop forms, your anchor is going to actually pivot and turn towards your target. So if you watch your anchor, a lot of times this will help you get your timing on and also kind of give you an idea how much power does it take to turn that anchor and form my D-loop. So two things to remember to keep your timing perfect. So now that you've set your anchor, you've formed your D-loop, it's time to make the forward cast. There's three things I want you to think about with the forward cast. Straight rod tip path, a smooth acceleration with a late power application, and a nice positive rod tip stop. So when you're in your firing position, you've formed your D-loop. The first thing we're going to talk about is really just what your rod tip does. When we were doing a roll cast, we made a straight line down to about 9 o'clock. That rolled the loop low along the water. When you're making a Spey cast, we want to think about stopping the rod a little bit higher. So we're going to make a straight line and we're going to stop a little bit higher, maybe at about 10:30. The most important thing here, guys, is that your rod goes in a straight rod tip path. If your rod goes in a convex rod tip path, in other words, if you kind of roll your forward hand and the rod goes like this, like you're painting the inside of an igloo, you're going to throw a big wide open loop. A straight rod tip path will throw a tight loop. So a tight loop has better stability, it's going to go faster, it's going to go through the wind, and it's going to allow you to cast further. So the second thing I want you to think about is the power application along that straight rod tip path. Just like every other element of the cast, we're going to start smooth and slow and put the power application late in the stroke. We need to get that rod tip bending. If you start with 60 miles an hour, the rod's going to bend so far that it's actually going to travel in a concave rod tip path, and that's going to throw a tailing loop. So if you start smooth and easy, put the power application after the rod reaches about 12 o'clock. From 12 o'clock to the end of the cast, we can put just about as much power into that stroke as we want. But if we don't start smooth and easy, the rod tip is probably going to throw a concave rod tip path. So the third thing I want you to think about is, after you've made that straight rod tip path, after you've made the acceleration, it's just thinking about making a nice positive rod tip stop. So your bottom hand does a lot of the work here pulling the rod through the stroke, and your top hand does a lot of the work stopping the rod. Don't get too wrapped up right now with using bottom hand and top hand, but just think about, making an easy cast and accelerate late, let that top hand really stop the rod. That's going to really help tighten the loop. So let's take some line out and actually make a forward cast. We're going to set our anchor, lift to our martini, come around, straight rod tip path, smooth acceleration, power to a stop. You're going to get a nice tight loop. Watch that again. Now watch what happens when I make a big wide open loop. My rod tip is going to go up and around, and you can see the loop has no energy to go through this wind. I'll do that again. Big wide open loop, the rod tip makes a big wide open casting stroke. Bring that back to a straight line, you're gonna get a nice tight loop. Now watch what happens when I put the power application too early. I throw a tailing loop. The rod tip can't handle that much shock that early. So just to summarize with the forward cast, what I want you to think about is straight rod tip path, smooth acceleration, and a nice positive rod tip stop, and you're gonna get some great loops. A few common mistakes that happen in this cast are pretty easy to correct. You know, one of the things that I see a lot is many people started spey casting with longer bellied lines. So you were probably taught to start with your hands crossed in front of you, much like this. So when you make your setup, you come back to that motion. That's not necessarily wrong, but you know, when you've got a longer line, you need to make a much bigger range of motion to move all of that line. In my experience, what that has done is when you sweep into your D loop, now all of a sudden it's much easier to open your casting stroke up. If you start on your left hand, left hip start position, now as you sweep, you can keep your hands inside of the box. It's a little bit of personal preference, but again, in my experience, starting on this side of your body makes it easier to lift the tip out, and it puts you in a better position to keep a nice compact stroke. So one of probably the most fatal errors in this cast is in the anchor setup. And when I say fatal, I mean fatal to your rod. We talked about making a vertical lift up to the top of your D and then accelerating around the D. Well, if you start to make that lift and your rod starts to move over the water first, in other words, we're not lifting that fly out of the water. Now, as you start to come around, you're struggling to get that fly out, wham, and you hit your rod with your fly. Fly rods don't like that. So the correction is just think about a vertical lift. It's going to help you, number one, get that fly up to the surface, but number two, it's going to keep your rod in a position where you're not going to end up going to the warranty department of your favorite rod company. Another common error is making your initial movement much larger than it needs to be. You know, I think a lot of times when you're throwing a big heavy sink tip and a big fly, you feel like you've got to start moving super fast. And what happens is the rod loads up, and by the time that fly actually comes out of the water, your rod is way upstream from you. Remember, if we're going to cast, let's say that way, I should be making that snap T move right in the confines of this triangle. So if I start really, really fast, my rod goes way beyond that, then I've got to try to get it back, and that's a lot harder to do. If you're doing this right, it should be almost effortless. Keep your hands close to your body, use that bottom hand. Not only is it more efficient, but it's a lot more fun. And if you're fishing over a long fishing vacation, say 4, 5, 6 days, if you're doing this all day, you're just wearing yourself out. If you're doing it the right way, you're gonna stay much less fatigued. So another common mistake is just starting your D loop too fast, whether it's the lift or whether it's the sweep. When you set up to make your anchor, a lot of times people lift really fast, and that just creates slack. They lose the tension on it. Think about that lift. It shouldn't be mechanical. It should just be a vertical lift up. It's almost like when you learn how to single hand cast, you know, you're taught to make a straight rod tip path, stop, and drop. And it's very mechanical at first. As you get better, that becomes kind of one motion. It's the same thing with the vertical lift. Just make an easy lift up. Same thing on the sweep, smooth and easy. You don't have to start that move fast. If you start slow and easy, you're gonna build the tension through the cast, and it's gonna give you much more control. The next thing I want you to be really careful of is when you start that D-loop, if you put the gas too early, now your D-loop is trajecting upstream and it's out of your 180-degree plane. A lot of times you'll notice when the fly lands out in front of you, you're going to get almost like a hook. Your fly lands upstream from where your line landed. That's typically caused because your D-loop isn't in line with your forward cast. So if you're seeing hooking in your cast, more than likely you're not getting your energy straight behind you. So the solution is just think about starting a little smoother and slower, putting that power application in your D-loop plane a little bit later, right there. Get that D-loop to go straight behind in the 180-degree plane, and you're going to get a straight cast every single time.